All righty. So I know we're in the interest of time, we will go ahead and kick things off. Good afternoon, everyone. It looks like we don't have audio control on our end, so I please ask everyone to mute yourself just so we can make sure that our guests today have the floor and can take us through the information that we're going to be talking about, all things cybersecurity. So I am Evan Shai. I'm the CEO of Coding Temple. Welcome to the CyberSafe, Cybersecurity Readiness and Resiliency Workshop for Startups and SMBs. It's wonderful to see so many faces joining us today to explore a topic that I know we believe, and presumably you believe by being here, that is no longer optional, but imperative to remain competitive in business of any size. And fortunately for us, we are joined by two distinguished experts in cybersecurity today. We have Grace Czechowski Llojaj. Grace, a senior cybersecurity account manager at Piper Companies, brings her expertise in strengthening cybersecurity frameworks to achieve growth objectives for SMBs and large corporations. We also have Dominic Vogel. Dominic is the founder and chief strategist at Cyber.sc. Brings 15 years of experience in the field, and he specializes in personalized cybersecurity advisory services, also with the focus on startups and small to medium-sized businesses. Now, in our collective ongoing effort to try and expand access to cybersecurity training, I am very excited to announce two scholarships today. We have the $1,000 Dominic Vogel Diversifying Cybersecurity Scholarship and a $1,000 Grace Czechowski Llojaj Scholarship for Advancing Women in Cyber. Now, you'll find more information and application links in the chat, so please check that out. We'll also include it in a follow-up material subsequent to the conversation today. Now, at Coding Temple, and the reason that we are here and we're putting on events like this, our commitment to cybersecurity is more than just a product, right? It's an investment in the future. And this year, we've significantly ramped up our investment in this critical field. And our goal is pretty simple. We want to be your go-to source for job-ready cybersecurity skills. And as we navigate today's workshop, I encourage everyone here to actively engage with our speakers and the material presented. We will have a Q&A portion at the end. What I'll suggest during the talk, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat, or if you want to keep them anonymous, you can do it in the type form, which there's a link in the chat as well. So without further ado, Grace and Dominic, we are in your hands.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Evan, for that intro. We're definitely excited to, share some of our experience in the cybersecurity space, particularly getting folks, to a position of readiness and resiliency. So we've prepared, along with the folks at Coding Temple, a little bit of a checklist we're going to walk through, and I think that'll be shared out after the session as well. Dominic, anything else you want to add before we get going?
No, I love the energy. Let's just dive right in, Grace.
Love it. So we kind of broke it up into a few different categories. So tactical cyber preparedness, governance and compliance, and then your leadership level cyber preparedness. So we're going to start off at the tactical level. And one of the first things that I always suggest to organizations I'm working with as you're kind of assessing where you need to go is assessing where you're at. So I think that really starts out with getting a sense of kind of a cyber inventory, if you will. What are your endpoints? How many endpoints you have? What applications are on those? What types of network infrastructure you have? Things of that nature. Dominic, what else should we be thinking about from that kind of infrastructure defense mechanism perspective?
Well, and I love that concept too, Grace, because again, it's really, again, you need to know what you have. If you don't know what you have, you can't protect it, right? So really understanding your current infrastructure, the components that make up your infrastructure, know what you have, and you can build out the right safeguards around that system and around that data as well.
Absolutely. So once you have that sense of that inventory baseline of where things are at, then you can start to assess where do we have some vulnerabilities, and doing some assessment around there. Once you have a sense of where you have some gaps in your current system, then you can really start to prioritize how you want to potentially remediate those.
Absolutely. And the thing I think is so important about this as well, is that being able to understand, it's a good reminder to turn off your ringer, by the way. The thing I think is so important to remember about things with like vulnerability assessments is the notion that you need to know where your weaknesses are. Sort of building off what we said before about knowing what you have, you need to know where your weaknesses are and recognizing that those weaknesses aren't a point in time. I think it's so important that you do this on a frequent basis, a continuous basis, again, depending on your budget and capabilities. Just checking out your vulnerabilities or weaknesses once a year, that's not really good enough, especially with how frequently code changes and infrastructure changes. You need to be able to have your fingerprint or your pulse on how often vulnerabilities are coming up into your environment. And the bit that I love what you mentioned there too, Grace, is around prioritization. Not all vulnerabilities are created equal. So let's focus on, let's prioritize and triage maybe your external facing systems or your most critical systems. And of that, what are the critical vulnerabilities? What are the vulnerabilities that are most likely to be exploited or known to be exploited? So don't just take a spray and pray approach to vulnerability assessment. Try and build out an actual program and structured approach.
Absolutely. And there's a ton of good resources on that. Like I would highly recommend everyone sign up for the CISA alerts. They are constantly notifying me. I think Dominic's probably getting 4 or 5 emails from them a day like I am, about identified vulnerabilities in different commonly used systems, whether that is something like from a Cisco network or a specific Splunk tool. And I did see someone drop in the chat, what kind of alerts did you say? It's CISA, it's the Critical Infrastructure Security Administration. So your tax dollars at good work if you're based in the US, putting some of those out to alert people to what vulnerabilities are being identified in systems. And to Dominic's point, then that allows you to understand how you might want to prioritize some of that stuff. And a big part of that is understanding what systems, as you're doing that inventory that we talked about, what systems are business critical. And that could be things that are customer facing. That could be things that, if this system goes down, then everything goes down. So understanding the parent-child relationships between your systems, data flows within your environment, things of that nature, I think is really critical as well to help to prioritize a lot of that stuff. So that's kind of from more of the, I would say like proactive side of things, for the most part. Of course, in the cyber world, we're always saying, it's not a matter of if, but when. When you're going to, unfortunately, have something that you need to react to. So that would be, your cyber incidents. So having an incident response plan is another really critical piece of that kind of tactical cyber preparedness. And from the incident response perspective, there's going to be things that, occur that are maybe anomalies within your system or different things that maybe don't escalate to the point of being like a true incident, but having an understanding of what types of things that could be. And that could be, the things that end up in the news are big data breaches and ransomware and things of that nature. So being able to play out a lot of that stuff, and understanding when do these incidents need further escalation, when are there, depending on the size or the type of company or type of data you're using, do you have reporting requirements around those things? But doing tabletop exercises and really like practicing what to do in those scenarios is going to be super critical for when it actually is happening in real time. And I think will just make, hopefully, your life a little bit easier when, the bad guys are at your door.
I love everything you said there, Grace. And I'll echo what you were saying there around again, we're talking about resilience here. And to me, resilience is you have the prevention, you have the detection, but so many people forget about the response capabilities, and laying that out from both a tech plan perspective. The only thing that really I would add to what you were saying there is having a communications plan as well. Having the technical response plan is absolutely vital. Don't get me wrong. But a lot of organizations overlook the communications plan. So in the event of a significant incident happening, ransomware, maybe client data or customer data gets compromised, who says what, right? You don't want maybe account reps talking to the to different clients about the data breach, especially if the facts aren't known. You don't want someone talking and posting something on social media, again, unless those facts aren't well known and validated. So having a very well documented communication plan, a well understood and trained communication plan, that's just as important. So I think it's super, super important that we recognize there's the technical piece and also the communication piece.
Absolutely. And that's going to help, on the backside of something that does occur, with being able to maintain your reputation in the market as well, which that is a whole nother piece of risk that, when you are hands on keyboard, kind of, heads down going through it, you're not necessarily thinking about. So again, being able to get some reps in on that plan ahead of time those tabletop exercises, they should be happening, in your SOC. They should be happening in your, who's on that incident response team, who is has some of those other business critical type of functions. Is your board or your senior leadership talking and doing a tabletop exercise, maybe at least once a year to understand what their role is in that. So I think that, to Dominic's point, the communication piece and having everyone understand what part they play is going to be super, super important from that preparedness perspective. Kind of moving through our checklist here. The next piece, and I'll kind of let Dominic speak first so I don't monopolize it. The continuous monitoring and threat management. When I say that, Dominic, what kind of comes to mind for you?
Well, I was going to say, there's such good interplay here. You're doing such a great job narrating. I like being the color commentator, but this is, to me, to your point there, I mean, I'd say this is something which is important from a higher level maturity perspective. Is this something that every organization is necessarily going to be able to do right out of the gate, especially if you're a startup? Not necessarily, but I do think as you're building out your cybersecurity capabilities, it's super important, again, to be able to have that, again, that special word, continuous security monitoring and threat detection. And again, depending on the, where you are, if you're in the Azure stack, AWS stack, or on-premise or what have you, again, the exact nature of what that would look like is going to be dependent on your environment, but making sure that you're building out some level of process so security alerts are being handled, that they are being processed, that there's a process for, like Grace, you were saying, some level of escalation, some level of making sure that if there are false positives, how do we make sure that we have fewer false positives? That is all part of growing out that broader threat management or continuous threat management program. Obvious, like I said, building blocks, but again, something to keep in mind and something that I'd say will be at maybe a higher level maturity as you go through the security curve.
Absolutely. I think on the maturity perspective, a lot of startups start off, unless you are like a true cybersecurity company, oftentimes you're starting off your, threat management, like managed detection and response type of program by using a managed security services provider or an MSSP or an MSP, so a managed services provider. So having a good relationship with that, vendor and being able to help them understand your system and your business critical processes and things of that nature, that's going to allow them to do their job better. So those vendor relationships, I think, depending on your maturity level, can also be super critical as something that you want to make sure that you're communicating with them what your, potential plan is and how you want them to prioritize threats in your system and that type of thing.
Yeah, well said.
Excellent. And then the last piece on that from a tactical perspective is patch management. So we all probably get, alerts on your phone that are like update your apps, and there might be some, security patches in there or other kind of, bug fixes, things of that nature. Dominic, from a cyber preparedness perspective, what should people be kind of thinking about from when you think patch management?
Yeah, and that's such a great point. And this ties to the earlier point where we're talking about vulnerability management, because the two are part of one life cycle, I'd say, right? The vulnerability management is sort of like the check on whether or not the security patches are being properly applied. And again, this can be a difficult chore for many organizations, but I mean, this is cyber hygiene. And what we see as when I look at the most when I see it in terms of a likelihood of an organization has a data breach or security incident, generally somewhere along the line that can be tied back to a critical security patch that wasn't applied. It's so important. And like I said, from a triage and prioritization perspective, anything external facing, customer facing, those critical, mission critical systems, make sure that they are getting their security patches on a frequent basis, whether that be tied to Microsoft's patch cycle, whether that be tied to the vendor's patch cycle, what have you. Just make sure that they are going through a process and that they are being applied as quickly and efficiently as possible. Because generally, I'd say, if you're having a window where critical security patches are taking 90+ days to be applied, that's a dangerous window to be in. We're looking at, I'm going to say at most 30 days, ideally sort of that 2 week, 14 days or so. So make sure that you're looking at this again, not just from a tool perspective, but from that broader triage and prioritization process perspective as well.
Absolutely. A couple things to add there. Your vendors are probably sending out when they're having updates. Some of them are on very regular cadences of when they do that. Others, there might be something that's identified that is very critical, that, they're going to push to you, that they're like, hey, we recommend you do this sooner rather than later type of thing. So just having your pulse on that, I think, is super important. And then the other piece is, especially for organizations that are rather lean and aren't able to maybe track all of this stuff quite as effectively yet, because you just aren't there. This is like, you probably have 77 other things that are on your to-do list besides like check what updates are on your applications. But automate as much as you can. Just make sure that you're backing up your system prior to doing that, or have some regular cadence with that, because there are times where a patch creates a different problem that you didn't foresee, and you need to roll that back right away to make sure that you do have that continuity in terms of other systems talking to each other or things of that nature. So backing up your system, and then the automation piece, I think, can really help people to just get into a regular cadence of making sure that those things are up to date. We do have a question in the chat, Dominic, so I'll pose this to you first. Is there a security baseline document for network/deployment infrastructure similar to the OWASP controls guideline?
Well, one of the things I would certainly point people to is the CIS hardening guidelines. That there's, if you just go to the CIS's website, that's the Center for Information Security. They have very well detailed guidelines and best practice hardening practices for all sorts of different systems and secure configurations and what have you. That's definitely a spot that I definitely point people to. Again, that tends to be very manually intensive. You have to go through all these settings. There are newer platforms that are focusing more so on automated enforcement. There's a company called Sention, which I think is a really great platform for having that level of automation, like you mentioned there. Grace, I think that's important to leverage automation where you can. So there's definitely some sources.
Absolutely. And I know CIS, they do a really good job of putting together these like work groups
Yes.
on different topics that take people from, frontline government to national security type of perspective, from academia and from industry, and bringing those people together. So I think that those are pretty robust. But there are also things that, different companies, different vendors that deploy agents in your system to kind of stay up to date with, those CIS guidelines as well. So there are some resources out there related to that too that you could probably look at. I know Puppet and Panacity are a couple that I'm familiar with from that kind of agent deployment perspective on that front. Excellent. So that probably gave you guys a lot of food for thought in terms of kind of tactical cyber preparedness. And so moving on into more of a compliance and governance perspective. I know one of the first things that people think about is kind of employee awareness and training. That's typically a pretty low-hanging fruit, but also you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck with a lot of that stuff. Whether that is, phishing campaigns or practicing through different social engineering situations and things of that nature, because quite honestly, our people are one of the biggest vulnerabilities in our systems. So again, from a kind of that employee training perspective, what should people be thinking about, Dominic?
It's, and we, to your point, we're unfortunately, we're still creating very fragile systems that are heavily reliant on users making a, good outcome or good security decision. So, that's why it's still so important around the awareness and training capabilities. And for me, the thing that I think is so important, there's so many great platforms out there right now. It's become so consumerized in a good way. There's a lot of different choices, but try to, rather than having staff or your employees go through training once a year, studies have actually shown that doesn't really lead to anything in terms of behavioral outcomes. If you want to do it just from a compliance perspective, then yeah, just do that. But if you're trying to derive better or more optimum security outcomes, leveraging what's often referred to as micro content, or just having a video maybe that comes out once a month or once every other month, and in that way it's sort of a drip effect, right? It's sort of like you're just like how I try to convince my teenage daughter of something. I'll just gently drop something over several weeks, and then eventually permeates into her brain, and she remembers. So being able to do that sort of a slow and steady drip effect is going to be more impactful than doing it once a year. And like I said, so many of the platforms KnowBe4 and other platforms allow you to leverage micro content that way.
Absolutely. And I think just again, from that perspective, getting people are different types of learners. So especially adult learners. So some people, if you put it in an email, it's not going to get read. It's going to go get straight to archive. Other people, unless they do have something that they are being held to, that's like, do this little Quizlet to confirm that you watched the video, they're not going to do it unless they are told that they have to. So just getting creative with how you can approach that content in different ways, and get it in front of people again, like more consistently, and try to make it fun. I know it's not like the most fun topic, but I'm someone that I'm always like, cyber's keeping me up at night, so maybe just to try to be a little bit more conscientious about these things. I think if you can share some of that and share your perspective and make it a little bit more human, and I think that goes a long way as well from that perspective. Some other things to think about from that compliance and governance perspective. I know access control and identity access management are definitely a couple hot topics. So in terms of that, how are you thinking about kind of user permissions or access controls within, your environments, Dominic?
It's, and on access control, I think it's so important. There's a principle in security that's referred to as the principle of least privilege. So basically, people should only have access to what they need in order to do their job, right? So everyone shouldn't have access to the financial records of their organization, or they shouldn't have all the HR records or things that have social security numbers or what have you. So making sure that you lay out an approach in terms of the access that is consummate with the work or the tasks that people need to do to fulfill their jobs. So that's something to keep in mind. And similar thing, like I said, from a data backup perspective as well, making sure that you're backing up what you need to back up. A lot of organizations will just back up everything. To me, data is a bit of a toxic asset as well. If you don't need to back it up, i.e. like social security numbers, then don't back it up, because stuff like that is toxic. And the more places where you save it, the higher likelihood that something could, negative, i.e. data breach, privacy breach, could happen. So be very clear about what it is that you're backing up, when you're backing it up, where you're backing it up, how it's being accessed, that type of thing. So take more of a data lens to this. And also, like I said, recognizing that there's a strange duality to data. Data is absolutely critical to making our organizations or modern organizations function, but they also have a toxic half-life to them as well, sort of like nuclear waste.
Yeah, and I think both of those things fit under the umbrella of data governance. So that is something that is often kind of layered on at the end of, as an organization reaches a specific maturity level. But if you can bake it in earlier on in your processes of understanding and like categorizing your data based on, again, like access, how long do we need to keep this? There are things that you do need, records you do need to keep. There are things like if I put my credit card in at, somewhere today, after they run that transaction, do they actually need to keep that? Like things of that nature. So just kind of going through with a critical lens and assessing your data and putting some of those like data governance best practices in and baking those in a little bit earlier on, I think can be really, really helpful in terms of making sure that, again, based on your industry, you are going to more readily be in compliance. You don't have to go back and put that in at the end. Or again, you're just making your system more resilient when, there is a threat actor that comes knocking. So I think that, again, is something that is definitely sometimes overlooked. Fantastic. So then that kind of is a good segue into the regulatory piece. Not every organization is the same from that perspective, obviously. If you are, a healthcare organization, you might have to comply with HIPAA. If you are taking, people's payment information, there might be, regulatory things around that specific type of PII or personal identifiable information that you're collecting on your customers. Or if you have government contracts, there obviously then you have to be, starting to comply with like CMMC and things of that nature. So from that regulatory perspective, oftentimes whoever your regulator is going to have a probably pretty extensive document outlining exactly what you do need to do. And they'll have some checklists and things of that nature. And sometimes you have to comply with multiple regulators. So where do those things overlap? And is there something that from a compliance perspective, you kind of need to have, one that is the stronger one, or sometimes your least common denominator, if you will, things of that nature. So anything else that people should be thinking about when it comes to cyber preparedness from that compliance and regulatory perspective?
I think you hit the proverbial nail on the head there, Grace. I mean, the only thing I would really add is making sure that you really understand also your customer requirements, security requirements as well. Again, yes, there's regulatory requirements, but also make sure sometimes your customers, depending on the space that you're in, maybe you're a B2B and you're selling in the insurance space or health space or what have you. Sometimes, depending on the customer, they may have even more stringent requirements. So really be in tune with your customer requirements as well. That's really the only thing I'd add.
Absolutely. And that's honestly how I got my start in the governance risk and compliance, like third-party risk space, was because our customers were coming and asking us, what are your plans? What are you doing? And, we needed an answer to some of that. So that is another good,
there you go.
Another good piece. We do have a related question in the chat. So at what point do you have enough PII to fall under CCPA, GDPR, et cetera? Is it merely name, address, and email enough? For a lot of us, that's all the PII that's stored. Do you have a sense of?
Sorry, yeah, I didn't write that very well. My bad. I'm a consultant. I'm constantly getting asked this question by customers, right? And they have user accounts, but they're very light PII, and it's very hard to say, hey, this is actually a covered PII, or this is so ephemeral data that it's not something we need to worry about.
Yeah, I know GDPR, I mean, they've shown themselves to have some teeth. So I would probably lean on the side of caution there. Understanding, maybe it's once the transaction is complete and confirmed, then there is, then maybe that your data governance policy states that is then deleted. Or, if you are wanting to save some of that stuff, that's where you might want to even put it in a third-party system that's holding it, so that they can then be kind of the one that is held accountable should there be some sort of data breach, and not put that on yourself. Like that's probably, if I were starting a company where I was taking payments and things like that, I would probably kind of go into that route, so that, my customers that are making, multiple transactions or things, they don't have to input all their information every time, but I'm not the one that is necessarily storing it.
Yeah. Good answer.
Got to put my lawyer hat on once in a while. How do I protect myself?
Yeah.
So hopefully that answered your question, John. Excellent. So I know there's a lot of hot buzzwords that come up, in tech in general, in the cyberspace. When you think about emerging threats, how do we get out ahead of some of those? How do we be proactive in planning? Because I know, like, at my clients, the board members or, you know, senior leaders, maybe that aren't as technical, will come to me and be like, I'm hearing about AI. What do I need to know? What are the things that kind of hit your desk, Dominic, where it comes to kind of emerging threats and kind of getting ahead of some of that from a compliance, governance, preparedness perspective?
Yeah, no, and it's such a funny question because, you know, sometimes I'll get those questions from the least mature organizations where they're still struggling with the basics, but yet they're worried about, you know, threats of tomorrow. You know, the threats of today are going to be what ultimately likely brings them down. So I think it's part of it is striking a balance, and again, bringing this back to risk. And I think this ultimately ends up being a really good segue to the next section around leadership level preparedness. But being able to tie this back to risk and be able to look at this through a risk lens and be able to say, well, in terms of, you know, there's yesterday's threats, there's today's threats, and then there's emerging threats. There's still so many organizations that are being brought down by yesterday's threats, right? So if we take a risk-based approach here and say, okay, let's shore up against yesterday's threats and today's threats, then we can start having conversations around emerging threats. It's great to be proactive, especially in this profession. I'm sure you would agree, Grace, that proactive is preferred to reactive. Not all, unfortunately, not all business owners and the executives see it that way, but I think where we can be proactive and at least be able to make sure that we're in a spot to be able to preemptively deal with emerging threats is important. But you know, the argument I always bring it back to is we can't deal with emerging threats if we're still getting shot down by today's threats and yesterday's threats.
Absolutely. I think it kind of goes back to, you know, the 80-20 rule type of thing. You know, most of your threats are going to come from, you know, things that are that we're already aware of. But the things that are in the news are, you know, the hot topics. So from that perspective, it's, you know, it's helpful to at least have everyone be educated and speaking the same language around some of those things, so that, you know, if something does occur, then you're not having to kind of catch people up to your day zero, which could be like today. Understanding kind of, you know, where the technology is at. So I think that there is, you know, some education that can be done around that proactively. In particular, I think that's probably where your efforts are best spent. But again, I'm not going to invest a ton in, you know, like generative AI type of things if I'm, you know, still don't have a strong like patch management system. That's just not how I'm going to prioritize. And to your point, like, you know, these things don't get attention until sometimes it's, you know, it's too late. And sometimes that attention means money. So again, just being able to make your case, I think, for some of the things that are those lower hanging fruits, that are the things that are going to be the most likely kind of, you know, threats is definitely where you should be spending the bulk of your time. Excellent. So that kind of is, again, to your point, a good segue into our last section on kind of leadership level cyber preparedness. So we are talking a lot about cyber risk, but when you are at the leadership level, you are thinking probably more about enterprise risk. So there's lots of different types of risk that, you know, are probably hitting your desk, and that you're having to think about. And in terms of that, like, you know, one of the examples that I always use, I have a client that is a large bank. They had a very public data breach several years ago now. And as so happens when those types of things happen, there was some turnover in the CISO seat. And when the new person came in, the board and the executive leadership was like, we need to lock everything down. We want to be the most secure bank, and nothing talks to each other, like basically unplug it. And they kind of had to be like, okay, but if that's impacting the user experience, if people can't access their money, then that becomes a business risk. So I think that that's like the piece at like a good example that you have to strike that balance and understand the risk tolerance of your organization. And that could, you know, be different across different functions, but having those high level conversations around risk tolerance and, you know, your exposure and things of that nature, and then breaking that down into oftentimes like dollars and cents, is definitely really a good place to start when you're thinking about cyber risk or other types of risk at the leadership level.
That's absolutely, Grace. And even just especially with ransomware having been such a digital wildfire the past few years and likely for the foreseeable future, even framing conversations around that in terms of downtime. So if ransomware is to bring down the organization, having this conversation at the board level or executive level for if ransomware brought us down for an hour, economically, what would that mean? 3 hours, 5 hours, a day, 3 days? At what point is the board screaming uncle, right? And I think it's so important to even frame it from that perspective, because then that helps again influence what the security strategy would be. So if from an alignment perspective or tolerance perspective, they'll say, yeah, we can tolerate being down for 3 days. Great. How we ultimately lay out a security strategy to deal with that would look very different than, let's say, maybe a fintech company that says, we're measuring downtime in minutes, right? We can't afford to be down for more than a few minutes. Okay, well, that's a very different security strategy, whole other level of budget and what have you. But the thing is, so many organizations, especially at the board and executive level, they never have this discussion, and they just assume IT, the IT guys or their service provider will take care of it. But the thing is, that leads to a misalignment, that leads to assumptions. And often a lot of these IT service providers, they'll do best effort for maybe 3 days. And I've seen this. I've had calls from angry prospects and people calling saying, oh, I thought our service provider could get us back up in a few hours, but they told us, 3 days. And then when I spoke with the service provider, they said, yeah, no one ever asked us, and we just assumed 3 days was best practice, right? So if you're in a position of an executive position or in a board position, ask these questions.
Absolutely. And I think some of that goes back to even we were talking about tabletop exercises earlier on, or kind of running through some of these scenarios, like from ransomware perspective, what is your organization's ransomware policy? Do you negotiate? Do you not? Do you have cyber insurance? Is your policy going to be sufficient? Really talking through those things before it's on fire is definitely going to be obviously the best way to go. So setting that time aside to do so is super critical. So yeah, I'm 100% with you on that front.
And the other thing I'll quickly add to that, Grace, is real quick too, is also around data loss. So again, how much data loss would you be willing to tolerate, right? If you were to lose an hour's worth of data, is that tolerable? 3 hours, 5 hours, a day, 2 days? Because even in the event of something like ransomware, what have you, there may be a spot where there's some level of data integrity issues or data loss. Again, focusing around it from an economic perspective and that data perspective, I think is so important, because, like I said, I just don't see that conversation happening until, like you said there, it's happening after the fact, and that's the worst time to have that conversation.
Absolutely, and that kind of goes into some of, again, understanding your risk tolerances, or even industry specific concerns as well. So the latest SEC guidance uses the word materiality quite a bit. Yep. What is material to my organization is going to be different than what is material to yours. So again, having a conversation and putting a clearer definition for your organization around that. And of course, SEC isn't going to apply to everyone, but I know a lot of other regulators are looking to that guidance and are probably going to, of course, all put their own flavor on it, because we can't just copy paste. We have to make it a little bit difficult for everybody. But I think a lot of people are going to be using that word materiality. So understanding what that looks like for your organization right now, but then also as you scale, because that is going to be very different with time as your organization continues to grow. So that's another piece that I think that at the leadership level, you need to have a clear understanding of.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, Grace. And I love the whole notion around security needs to scale and change as your organization changes. Your approach to cybersecurity when you're a 5-person startup, that should look very different than when maybe you're a 50-person company, or maybe you've now ballooned to a 500-person organization. It needs to be intertwined in the fabric and the DNA of your organization, and it needs to evolve as such.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know we're kind of getting close on time here, so I do want to leave some time for additional questions. But I think that we touched on a lot of the topics that are in our kind of checklist that y'all will get after the conversation here today. But so maybe, I don't know if Evan, you want to rejoin us and see if there's any other questions that we want to touch on.
Yes, thank you so much. I think you were able to hit a number of them as we went, so I appreciate you incorporating some of the questions from the chat. I know we touched on this a little bit, but Is there a particular size or stage or environmental circumstances that a company reaches where they really become more at risk and they know they need to make some meaningful investments in starting to think about it differently? I know we need to think about it from the beginning, but are there particular characteristics that we need to be aware of that make us more at risk?
I'm sure you have a thought on that, Grace, but I mean, for me, to me, once you start taking on customers, that's the point, right? Like you need to be doing it at that point. If you are maybe MacGyvering it a little bit before when you are, trying to get everything afloat, sure, I get that. But once you start accepting customers, that to me is the inflection point.
Yeah, and I think like your risk exposure just continues to scale as your revenue does. And different solutions are going to, fit your organization at a different time. There are, SIM tools that are really built for, having up to a certain number of endpoints, but once you hit, 250 endpoints, that solution just doesn't necessarily make sense for you anymore. So that constant reevaluation from a tooling perspective, from your environment, and then also, again, just your risk tolerance is really going to, I think, be some of the levers that you want to look at as to, where those inflection points are for your organization.
Okay. I'm going to try to fit one more in, given the context and the recommendation of being proactive in planning for emerging threats, and especially with developments like AI and other technologies, how can startups and small businesses who kind of inherently have limited resources stay ahead of the curve in identifying and mitigating some of these new forms of cybersecurity risk?
Well, good question.
I think, you just using your resources wisely. So take those low-hanging fruit type of things, like, you can go online and find some information on how to educate your workforce around cybersecurity that is, relatively low cost. You can find things that like doing an inventory of your system realistically at that startup stage shouldn't be something that is a huge heavy lift from a financial perspective. Again, thinking through different scenarios, starting to put together the bare bones of an incident response plan. Again, doesn't need to be something that is a huge investment. Starting to automate some of that patch management stuff. Like those are the little things that even just like putting having a VPN or putting a passwords on your Wi-Fi, using like multi-factor authentication or single sign-on. Like those are things that are very like low-hanging fruit type of things that do actually make a big difference in increasing your organization's security without having a ton of upfront costs associated with them.
The quick thing I'd add to that, Evan, too, is rely on specialists. I mean, if your budget allows, leverage a virtual or fractional or outsourced chief information security officer. There's so many great security professionals who have that experience and cater towards the startup community. As a startup founder and you have different things to do, security is often falls by the wayside. Why? Because you're working on product and customer stuff and your unique value proposition, all that stuff, right? Focus on what you need to do to take your company to the next level, and then bring in specialists. That's why we've seen the rise of so many fractional roles, not just in security, but leverage fractional security professionals where you can.
Totally. It makes sense, seems accessible. And even though these other things are particularly important to focus on in these early stages, there are catastrophic risks that could, render some of that work futile. So it's important to kind of still prioritize and keep that top of mind. Well, I know we are at time. Thank you, Dominic and Grace, for your time. Really appreciate you sharing all this wisdom with us. Everyone that attended, thank you for sparing some time with us and investing in learning a little bit more about cybersecurity. Everyone will receive the checklist created by Dominic and Grace, and we will provide that after the show, as well as feel free to send us any questions that you have. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful holiday season.